Anton-Wilhelm-Amo was stolen, taken by violence from his native country, that today's Ghana, and by Dutch slave traders. And he was given as a present, as a gift, to the Duke of Braunschweig. His brother was less fortunate. He took his way directly to the plantage of South America. And Amo was lucky insofar as this Duke of Braunschweig gave him an education, and so he could become doctor at our university and start to teach at our university. Then he moved to Ghana and then he moved to Jena first, and there he was, suffered some racist attacks. You could call it today this way. And then he decided to go back to Ghana, and where we have the report of a Swiss doctor of a Dutch ship who visited him and at the end of his life, and as a well-honored and very important person also in his, so to speak, homeland. Now today, Amo has become something like an international or worldwide icon, just showing the absurdity of the possibility to steal someone, to take him by violence from his home, and to give him as a gift to somebody else, to treat a human being as a property that can be alienated and given to someone. On the other hand, he's an icon as well because he made this academic career, showing in this time, and this was important, that there's no problem for anybody from any part of the world becoming also an successful and really well-respected academic teacher. This double view on Amo gave us a reason to dedicate to him this kind of lecture, and I'm very pleased to have one very important person, one of the leading figures of today's post-colonial studies, Professor Achille Mbembe. He will be introduced more efficiently by my colleague Richard Rothenburg. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here. I want to add a sentence to the introduction Matthias just gave. When Matthias and myself, we initiated the named lecture, the Amo-Lecture, we intended to establish a highbrow platform for contemporary and historical debates on critique, emancipation, decolonization, with a particular focus, namely a focus on projects that interrogate the situatedness of every claim of universality or universalizing claim. To judge on whether we have succeeded in doing what we have promised to do, I defer to you, and also I must say to the authorities of this university. Another more personal remark, since I am no longer a professor of this university, but a retired professor of this university since the 1st of October, and since I will join Achille at his institute at Weiser at the University of the Witwatersrand in January, in some sense Achille is also here to help me say goodbye to the Amo lectures, which I have initiated together with Matthias. And I think we all hope that Matthias will find new and strong allies in the university who will understand the importance of having this lecture, particularly during the difficult times we are, again, one must say, living through, living in, when deeds and expressions of xenophobic and racist hatred to be seen and heard in Germany during the last 5 years have reached a level that was unimaginable 10 years ago. So these were my two introductory remarks. Now I'm introducing the speaker of today. Since 2003, Achille Mbembe is a research professor for history and politics at Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg in South Africa. He obtained his Ph.D. in 1989 at Pantheon-Sorbonne University in Paris. Subsequently, he obtained a diplôme d'études approfondies in political science at the Institut d'études politiques, also in Paris. He then moved to the USA, where he was following the usual American career, but a little bit faster, an assistant professor for between 88 and 90 at Columbia University, then a senior research fellow from 90 to 91 at the Brookings Institute, an associate professor from 92 to 96 at the University of Pennsylvania. Between 1996 and 2000, Achille was executive director of the Council for the Development of the Social Sciences in Africa, CODESRIA. And at the end of this period, I think he happily withdrew from that management position. I think he also made others happy by withdrawing from that position and accepted a part-time position at Duke University, which he holds until today. Since 2016, he is a member of the American Academy of Sciences. Achille's publication, originally mostly or always in French, have attracted a wide audience and international attention since the early 90s. For instance, in Germany, you might not remember or be aware, he was first introduced to a broader intellectual public or audience through an article, Raubtiere und Reformen, Niedergang des Staates und Risiken der Demokratisierung, which was published in Lettres Internationales in 1993. His first widely quoted and celebrated essay was on postcolonie, which was published in 2001 with University of California Press, Berkeley. And 1 year before that, in French, De la postcolonie, Essai sur l'imagination politique dans l'Afrique contemporaine, with Katsala, which is his French publishers until today. Equally important became his article, Necropolitics, which was published in 2005 in the journal Public Culture. Now, since the list is long, I jump to the end. His last 3 books were translated into German soon after, or ever sooner after they appeared in French, and also sooner than they appear in English nowadays, which is due to the interest of Surkamp. Ausgang aus der langen Nacht, Versuch über eine Entkolonisierung Afrikas, Surkamp 2016, and the original in French 2010. Kritik der schwarzen Vernunft, Surkamp 2014, and the original 2013 in French. And Politik der Feindschaft, Surkamp 2017, in French 2016. Soon after his book Critique of Black Reason appeared in German, Achille received the 36 Geschwister Scholl Award in 2015. And this year he received the Gerda Henkel Award in Düsseldorf, and actually tomorrow he will receive the Ernst Bloch Award in Ludwigshafen. So, Achille, I'm happy that you made it. Since many years we had this intention. And now, so to speak, in the last moment, on my way out, I'm happy to welcome you here. And I kindly ask you to come and give your talk. Thank you very much for coming.
would like to express my deepest gratitude to Matthias and to my very dear friend Richard. I'm happy to deliver this lecture in memory of Amo, whose life, as Matthias suggested, was finally a gift, not to an owner, but to the world at large. And I would like to thank the university for making a little place for Amo. And in so doing, gesturing towards the kind of, that's better, the kind of, I would say, unconditional hospitality institutions such as universities should aspire to become. Especially, as Richard said, in these times, and it is my hope that this gesture will be sustained and expand. We are all aware of the ongoing controversies surrounding the question of whether or not to return to the owners the African artifacts conserved in Western museums. It's a controversy that is going on not only here, but also in France, in the continent itself, in Belgium, in the UK, and elsewhere. These controversies are unfolding at a time when Europe seems to be closing its doors and is increasingly reluctant to let more strangers, migrants, and foreigners in. And from an intellectual point of view, we are witnessing a renewed interest in the question of the life of objects and the objects of our lives at a time when more and more objects are digital, immaterial, or increasingly abstract. This is therefore a time when what we could call the ontology of objects is changing. And the old opposition between subjecthood, personhood, and objecthood, this old opposition is somewhat under duress. Just like many other boundaries, nature, culture, and so forth and so on, boundaries are under duress almost everywhere at the time when they are being reactivated simultaneously. Now, in my mind, the notion of savage objects, which I will be coming back to during this lecture, refers to artifacts which historically originated from Africa and which were caught somewhat in the dramatic conflict of representations that characterized the Afro-European encounter, starting, of course, with the Portuguese, their voyages of discovery, trade, and evangelization in the 15th century. Four key properties were then attributed to what are called savage objects. First, everywhere that they made their appearance, they tended to give rise to effects of blindness. originally, they were considered as dirty, ugly, and monstrous objects. In short, they were considered as signatures of the shadow. But those signatures of the shadow that resist all translation. And as such, they shook up existing ocular frameworks and put back on the agenda the old question of what an image is. And how is it that an image differs from a simple silhouette? They force back into the agenda the old question about what art and aesthetic experience in general are and how they manifest themselves in their pure truth. Furthermore, these artifacts long aroused on the part of the West, generally understood, all sorts of sensations, ambiguous feelings, visceral and contradictory reactions, fear and fascination and wonder, horror and frustration, or even execration. So that's the first set of properties I attribute to this concept of savage objects. Second, savage objects are artifacts which have gone through a process of migration. At times, forced removal and migration, and which, in the process of museumification, have become the property. Here we are again with the question of property, not talking about the gift, have become the property not of those who made them in the first instance, but of the West, let's just call it as such, which since then has kept them in its institutions where they are now curated. Finally, these are objects that were rediscovered in the first years of the 20th century and finally conferred their status as work of art. So you can see the journey of these objects from objects of abjection, if you want, to objects or works of art. So as we speak about restitution, it seems to me that we have to foreground the philosophical and political stakes surrounding this debate. And in order to do so, we need to pause and reflect on a long tradition in the West when it comes to the relation between humans and artifacts or objects, technical or not, whether they are technical objects or not. We have to rethink, if we want, about this. It is not the only one, but this is a tradition in which all the tools, machines, technological artifacts, and devices with which we interact are thought to serve either to replace human action or to respond to human expression or sensation. It's also a tradition where it is always believed that there is a risk attached to the making and use of objects. How much of the human activity should they replace? And since much of the human activity takes shape through the human body, how much of that body should they replace? To what extent should they be made at the image of the human and of that very body. These are some of the questions when you look into the history of the relationship between objects and people in the dominant Western tradition. These are questions that permeate those debates. You find them in Marx, you find them in Le Roy-Gourand, you find them in Stigler, and in many other bodies of text that are available. So in a sense, in this tradition, there have always existed a constant obsession about how to keep tight the borders between the human and that which he or she creates. The anxiety has been such that borders might be erased, and with their erasure, the loss of the knowledge concerning where machines and objects should end and where bodies should begin. It's a permanent obsession. Our contemporary intimacy with machines has also exacerbated this anxiety, and it has made identifying the point where machines should end and bodies begin more difficult than ever. Witness, for instance, the spread of multi-touch interfaces through digital devices of all kinds, virtual objects on computer screens, and the sensory stimulation that they generate. Or take into consideration the fact that robots nowadays can realistically reproduce human movements or be used as surrogate bodies or act upon the world in place of a human being. So that anxiety and obsession has not at all gone away. In fact, it is accompanying our transition to the new technological age we are entering. The point I want to make by recalling all of this is that this anxiety has never been universal. In Africa, for instance, the impossibility of ever fixing such a boundary between objects and humans was always recognized as the starting point in the human-objects relationship. I could extend on that, but just trust me with this statement for the time being. Objects were part of us, and we were part of objects. It was recognized that the relationship between persons and artifacts was always going to be somewhere an embodied experience. You find it in various African cosmologies. Mont de Dogon, studied by Marcel Griol and the French anthropological tradition, is the same thing in Central Africa, with the works as evidenced by a whole body of work by historians and anthropologists such as Jan van Sina, James Fernandez, Wyatt McGaffey, and so forth and so on. Now, during the encounter between Africa and Europe, the realization that there will always be some degree of entanglement, even reversibility between persons and objects, this was dismissed as animism. In the process, what was really dismissed as animism was, in fact, a different way of accounting for objects' own agency. A different way of accounting for the way we sense and act with objects and without, a way in which the human body is not just one more object interacting with other objects and the technologies that surround it. Now, thank God, with the new state of mind we live in, let's say there is more and more, with the object-oriented turn, there is an increasing recognition of the agency of objects. So to some extent, everyone is becoming animist today. If we have never been modern, at least today we are all becoming animist. We're all becoming African, if you want to take it further. Now, I could tell you more about this tradition, but we don't have much time for that. Let me move on. So today, the question of knowing whether or not to return to the Assagnis, the African artifacts conserved in Western museums, is a transient one. Very few, however, concern themselves with understanding what had originally justified the migration of these objects to Europe. Why are they here? And while they are here, what function were they supposed to fulfill? Further still, many do not know either what the real aesthetic value is, still less what they were the signifier of in European consciousness. In such conditions, I think it is important to return to the essential. So, let us pose the questions in the clearest possible manner. What precisely does one want to divest themselves of, and why? And why now? What will remain of the traces of these objects in the West once they have been repatriated, and what mode of existence will their absence make possible? Is the work that these objects were supposed to accomplish in the history of European consciousness finished? What will it have produced in the end, and who ought to bear the consequences of it? After these objects having been present in institutions for so many years, has Europe learned at last how to come to terms with those who come from outside it, and even from extremely far away? Is Europe finally ready to embark on the path to destinations that are yet to come? Or is it but a pure crack, a thing that is split in pure loss, without depth or perspective? It seems to me that we cannot talk about restitution without taking these deeper questions on board. And these questions are addressed not only to Europe, but also to Africa in this case. If we do not take them on board, then, let me put it differently, we will make your task too easy. And it's not in anyone's interest to make your task easy after all that you have done. So you see, that's the perspective I would like to develop tonight. Now, let us stop to look at the first years of the 20th century. Let's keep the long period going from the 15th century on, 15th century, 20th. Let's just look at the first years of the 20th, when, after having long scorned these objects, the West started to rediscover them and to assert their purely formal and plastic qualities, to assert the sensation of depth that they evoke, or again, their way of engendering space, their power of affective intensification, and so forth and so on. Something you find, I was talking with Judith about Carl Einstein and his work, Naked Plastic. This is the object precisely of this work, and he is probably among the first to begin to be interested in the formal qualities of these objects, to be interested in their aesthetic qualities. So here Germany somewhat opened the path for others to follow. So Einstein, for instance, argues that these objects freed sculpture not only from all perspective, but also from all pictorialness. At the same time, and for its part, the then nascent ethnography sought to embed them in their context of birth with the aim of disclosing their social meanings. So basically you have two traditions that emerge at the beginning of the 20th century. One tradition that is preoccupied with the aesthetic qualities of the objects, the formal properties, the intensive surfaces, and another tradition that is preoccupied with restituting these objects to the sociological, ethnographic context in order to elicit what they mean in those contexts, which is different from what they mean in museums when they go through the process of museumification. And it seems to me that we are still, for those who are interested in this intellectual history, we are still seeing this tension in the study of African objects today. Now, you would ask, but why is it that after 3-4 centuries of depreciation, why is it that suddenly at the beginning of the 20th century, Europe feels the need to give to these objects, abject objects, the status of works of art? What's going on? Why the change of heart? What's going on is, first of all, that Europe has hit a crisis, or is hit by a crisis. At the time when it recognizes the status of objects of art to African objects, it is in the middle, engulfed in the middle of a very serious crisis, of which a number of philosophers have written about. Europe is living in the belief that it has forgotten something fundamental. And it believes that possibly a return to the African sign may enable it to rediscover this thing fundamental that it has forgotten. What is this something that Europe says it has forgotten? Europe says it has forgotten something stemming from, let's just call it the memory of pure forms. It is in search of pure forms, how to reconnect with the memory of pure forms. Pure forms meaning what? Pure forms meaning forms that are freed from every origin, and because they are freed from every origin, they are susceptible to open the path to an ecstatic state. An ecstatic state meaning that ultimate degree of expressive intensity and the sublime point of sensation. Europe is looking for ecstasy. And it believes that it has lost the connection with the possibility of experiencing ecstasy, and therefore experiencing pure forms. And that maybe, if it goes to Africa, it will find it and reconnect with it once again. This freeing from all origin is at the same time, or at least perceived at the same time, as a freeing from all perspective. Negro art, because that is the name given to it then, l'art nègre, Negro art, so the claim goes, reduces the psychic distance between spectator and image to the point where suddenly the invisible aspects inherent to the image appear. That in fact, an image is many things at the same time. And that what is really the essence of the image is that which is invisible, that which you cannot see, or you can only see as a result of the deployment of a set of capacities not everybody is entitled or owner of. Which is indeed, by the way, a very African quote-unquote thing. So, underlying itself therewith is the possibility of an absolute perception. The object is not only contemplated by consciousness, but also by the psyche. That is what Europe is looking for. So that's the first, let's say, epistemic conditions, which have, of course, various political implications. We're in the middle of colonialism. The conditions under which these objects, abject objects, become works of art. So when we say we want to restitute them, does it mean that the work that they were supposed to do, which I have just described, has been done, and now we don't need them any longer, and we can dispense of them? I think is not it is an important question to ask if you want. The belief then is also that Negro art suggests other ways of representing space, ways whose character is at once symbolic and optic, in the sense that what these objects give to be seen is a mental equivalent of the image rather than the image itself. It elicits thus another modality of seeing. Seeing does not require that the eye be immobilized. On the contrary, it is about liberating the eye, about rendering it active and mobile, about setting it in relation to manifold other psychic and physiological processes. So there's a big discussion then on what it means to see. And, of course, equally, what it means to not see, which is a question which is still with us, which is with us nowadays more than ever before. The conditions under which we choose to see, whether we have a capacity to see, and under what conditions is it that we don't want to see. Because seeing comes with a set of responsibilities. And under certain conditions, maybe it's better to not see. So this question of is more than the question of visibility. I'm talking about seeing. As a philosophical question, but also as a political question. So, the eye, the belief is that with African art objects, the eye is not a dead organ. Going on what it sees and what it recognizes, its work is to explore what is missing, to reconstruct on the basis of multiple traces the object staged in the image, in short, to elicit its appearing, to create the conditions for it to come alive. That's the function, the ultimate function of the eye. To allow the object to reconnect with the forces of life, and therefore to animate it. The forces of life, in this case, being equal to the forces of movement. Because where there is movement, there is life. And where there is no movement, things are inert. I could go on and give you additional reasons why, at the beginning of the 20th century, the status of objects of art is conferred to these artifacts. For instance, reasons having to do with the preoccupation in the early 20s of stories of recommencement and stories of the end. Commencement being the point of departure of a mutation towards something else. The question then being whether art can effectively serve as a point of departure toward a future that would not merely be a simple repetition of the past. The end, as for it, being thought as a mode of accomplishment or a form of catastrophe. So at the start of the 20th century, African objects contributed to rekindling these core debates in a Europe searching for another thinking of time, another thinking of the image, and ultimately another thinking of the truth. This Europe, as I said a moment ago, was one of conquest, whose world domination was relatively well established. But it is also a Europe that was simultaneously beset with doubt, for in the last instance, this dominion over the rest of the world, and colonialism in particular, was set, as the great poet Aimé Césaire will later suggest, was set on an apocalyptic structure. This Europe wondered whether its dominion over the world was not ultimately purely spectral, and whether it was possible to elaborate a thinking of time, a thinking of the image, a thinking of the truth that was not a simple thought of nothingness, but a veritable thought of being and of relation, which you find then pushed to ultimate elaboration in the works of Heidegger, in the work of Husserl, and a number of others. So today, when there is much talk of restitution, we must recall the irreplaceable functions that in their ambiguity African objects will have fulfilled in Europe's historical trajectory. Now, on the precise topic of restitution, of course, everything is far from being settled. Legalism and paternalism determine the two sorts of responses generally mobilized by anyone who stands opposed to this project today. On the one hand, some claim that, in the last instance, the law by no means authorizes the return or transfer of these artifacts to their assignees. One desists from calling into question the external origin of these artifacts and their creators. Nevertheless, the response given to the question of knowing to whom they belong is presented as if it was absolutely independent of the supposedly prejudicial question of knowing whence they come and who their authors are. In other terms, a caesura is opened between the law of property and use on the one hand, and on the other hand, the act of creating and the creating subject. Notably, it is asserted that having made something does not automatically make one the owner of that thing. To make an object is one matter. Having the right to use, enjoy, and dispose of that thing exclusively and absolutely is another one altogether. And just as making does not equal possessing, a work's origin, we are told, is not a sufficient condition to be able to lay claim to its possession or to a right of possession. So this is absolutely in tune with, I would say, Amo's life. It's all about ownership, property, and law. Further, the acquisition of these objects is, in truth, presented as if it took place in an entirely unproblematic condition, as if, from start to finish, it involved transactions between equals on a free market where the value of objects was determined by an objective pricing mechanism. And that wasn't the case, and we see it, for instance, in the work of Michel Léris, Afrique Fantôme, part of which is about the Dakar-Djibouti trip commissioned by the French government as part of the enterprise of collecting African objects then. The conclusion drawn is that, having endured the market test, these objects are no longer without masters. Henceforth, they are inalienable, the exclusive property either of public authority as such, which manages them through its museums, or of private individuals who, having bought them, are qualified in the view of the law to enjoy them fully unhindered. From a legal viewpoint, the debate on the restitution is thus declared unfounded, as their presence in Western museums and other private institutions has nothing to do with confiscation and thus requires no judgment of a moral or political kind. That's basically the argument, in any case, in the French or Belgian context. I don't know how it goes here in Germany, but I'm sure that some parallels can be established. Now, posing the problem of restitution in this way is neither innocent nor neutral. I think it forms part of the strategies used by those who stand convinced that in a war, whether declared or not, the victor is always right and pillage is its compensation. The defeated party is always wrong, has no choice other than to thank his executioner, should this later spare his life, and has no automatic right to justice. In other terms, might creates right, and the law has no might that does not depend on the power of the victor. That is the philosophy of law that is convoked to justify the refusal to restitute the objects. Because in this philosophy of law, the law's function is then no longer to serve justice, but to guarantee existing force relations. So we need to leave that concept of the law behind, because it is dissociated from the obligation of justice. That's basically the point I'm making. We also need to leave behind an approach to restitution that is exclusively quantifiable, since restitution is then considered from the sole viewpoint of the institution of property and the law that ratifies it. So what I'm trying to do now, in case you get a bit lost, what I'm trying to do is to look into the key arguments that are put forward by those who refuse, who are opposed to the principle of restitution. I'm looking into that and assessing the validity of their arguments. And I'm trying to find a way of, therefore, coming up with a concept of restitution that goes beyond legalism and that goes beyond the institution of the private property. That's what I'm trying to do. Private property and the law of quantification, that which can be quantified. I'm trying to get out of that conundrum, which, as far as I can see, doesn't help us very much to, let's say, frame the issue in a future-oriented manner. Having said this, I think that the restitution of African objects is not the occasion for Europe to endow itself with a good conscience at a cheap price. That's really my preoccupation, that this doesn't turn into too easy an issue. The debate must be recentered around the historical-philosophical stakes of the act of restitution. And one then sees that every authentic politics of restitution is inseparable from what I call a capacity for truth, such that honoring truth and acts of repairing the world, because the two go together, become, by this very fact, the essential foundation of a new relationship. The point is, how is it that we imagine an entirely different relationship between Africa and Europe? Not by legalism, not by quantification, law of property and so forth and so on, but by coming back to the obligation for truth, the capacity for truth as a precondition for engaging in common in the act of repairing the world, because restitution, that's what it is all about, is about how is it that we repair the world that we have damaged through damaging relationships with ourselves and with others. Now, to honor truth we must still be able to call it to mind. And let me just summarize it then in one sentence. I'm looking for that sentence. It's buried very low in Look, the sentence is this. What we have lost as a result of Europe's engagement with us is priceless. It cannot be reimbursed, if you want to use these monetary terms. It's so colossal that even if Europe wanted to give it back, it wouldn't be able to. We have suffered a radical loss in our engagement with Europe. That is the starting point of any reflection, deep reflection on restitution. And there's no way in which we'll ever recover what we lost. We will have to live with that radical loss. But in turn, Europe owes us the truth about what happened. But you know, when you look at the history of our engagement with Europe, I mean, one thing a number of our thinkers, historians have found, is that Europe has a serious problem with the truth. It has a very deep problem telling the truth. And this is what is at the basis of, we were talking this afternoon about decolonization. The critique of universalism and of that, of modernity, part of that critique is based on the experience of a Europe that doesn't know how to tell the truth about what it has done. So it owes us a debt of truth. What it can restitute to us is the truth, which is that in our engagement with it, we have lost so much. And the objects, when you look at the objects and what they meant, what they referenced to, the kind of world they were part of, the meanings that were attached to them, how they were constituted, the kind of economy they were part of, a generative economy, the forms of knowledge that were necessary to make them, botanical knowledge, knowledge of trees as far as maths are concerned, knowledge of chemical processes, how you produce colors, other chemical processes, how is it that you make an object that has durability under the conditions, ecological conditions, let's say, of the rainforest. All that knowledge is gone. How will you ever restitute that knowledge? So that is, as far as I'm concerned, the real question. It's not about really whether or not you should restitute. It's about something deeper. And as we have known all along, it's very difficult for Europe to, let's say, deal with these kinds of matters for all kinds of reasons we don't have the time to look into today. So let me move towards the end. In fact, what we are witnessing today is a sense, people telling us, we owe you nothing. I mean, you know what, we really don't owe you anything. There's We don't owe anything to each other. And the relationship we'll have from now on will be premised on the fact that we do not owe anything to each other. But it seems we cannot repair the world on the basis of such an assumption. It is not possible to build a world, to engage in a politics of the future world, if we start from the assumption that we have nothing to do with each other and we don't owe anything to each other. Now, told you that knowledge is lost. Let me just go quickly. I think, of course, restitution is not the same thing as repentance. One does not, there are irreparable losses that no compensation can ever bring back, which does not mean it is not necessary to compensate. And to have compensated does not mean to have erased the wrong. But to compensate, as Kwame Anthony Appiah underlines, is about offering to repair the relation. And in fact, when we look at African pre-colonial systems of thought, that was the basis of any philosophy of restitution. Restitution had to do with the reparation of the relationship. And a reparation of relationship presupposed honoring the truth. So let me conclude all of this. I think that honoring the truth comes with the commitment to learn and remember together. And as Edouard Glissant never ceased to reiterate, and I quote him, each of us needs the memory of the other. This is not about compassion or charity. It's about a new lucidity in a process of relation. Glissant was very keen in examining that question of the relation. So, if we want indeed to share the world's beauty, he would add, we ought to learn to be united with all its suffering. We'll have to learn to remember together, and this doing, to repair together the world's fabric and its visage. So this is not about withdrawing into oneself, about allowing oneself to be inhabited by the obsession of one's own place. It's not about being among one's own kind, a kind of transcendental in itself. It's about contributing to the rising of new regions of the world where we will all be able to enter unconditionally. It's about embracing, eyes wide open, the inextricability of the world, its entangled nature, and its composite character. If restitution has to mean something, this is what it has to mean. Thank you very much.